Stanford University.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I very much enjoyed Bert's presentation, and it's interesting to be sort of the final speaker here and look at the impressive group of scientists, academicians that were gathered here over the last couple of days. I'm here in part, I think, because Sally Benson and I met on a trip to the Arctic, and it was at the time I was governor of Colorado and was in the middle of working on energy policy in a pretty serious way. We were joined on that trip by Rosalind and Jimmy Carter, by Ted Turner, Tom Daschle, Madeleine Albright, Larry Page from Google, Larry Brilliant from Google. I used to tell people, there were 40 of us that were principals. Sally was one of the principals, I was. I used to tell people, and this is while I was governor, if the boat had capsized, I would have been in the paragraph, also on the boat. It was really this great group. And what was fascinating at the time is we talked to some extent about the role of public policy in trying to develop an energy and an environmental agenda. It was 2008. It was about 3 or 4 months before Barack Obama was elected President of the United States. It was 6 months before he began serving as the President of the United States. And one of the things that was talked about was if Obama was elected, actually Meg Whitman was on the boat as well, Fred Malek, a well-known Republican operative. So there was a bipartisan group. It was Republicans and Democrats. And the question was, okay, if, let's just say, hypothetical, Barack Obama's elected in the first 100 days, can he carve out a national energy policy for the United States of America? It was really sort of prescient on Tom Daschle's part. And at that time, remember, we didn't know in July of 2008 he would have to actually pass a stimulus bill that would provide, in many respects, a lifeline to states across the country, do a variety of other things as well. But we didn't really know that that was going to come. And what Tom Daschle said is Barack Obama is going to have to pass a health care bill first. Too many people in his base will have to, will require that he do that first. What really happened was Barack Obama got elected. He spent a great deal of political capital passing the Stimulus Act, signing it in Denver actually in February of 2009. A year later, signing the National Health Care Reform in place. And today, 3 years into his presidency, we really don't have a national energy policy. We don't have a national energy policy that brings into play environmental issues in this country. So one of the things that I want to talk about today, and I think really why I was invited here, is just to talk about the role of state government in developing energy policy. So for those of us who look at this and are dismayed that Congress hasn't done more in the issue of developing this cohesive energy policy that several people have talked about today and that Bert just referenced, that we should not look at that and think there's nothing that can be done from a policy perspective. It may be a bias on my part, but as a former governor, I'll tell you, I think policy matters, and it matters a great deal. As I said, there have been really impressive scientists that have presented here. The talk this morning on natural gas, just the tutorial on natural gas as a governor from a natural gas state, I thought it was just a wonderful tutorial and something that should be shared in many places around the country where this has become such a controversial issue. The issue of the environmentally sound ways to extract natural gas, and are they possible? But having said that, I mean, I've been here, right? And I understand what we have experienced over the last couple of days. They're some of the best scientists in the world talking about the energy of this country, the energy future of this country. It's a fantastic conference, but from my perspective, it is important to include in, maybe not necessarily to end with, but to include in the discussion about policy. Because policy can operate as a barrier to doing what we're trying to do, or policy can operate as a facilitator. It can actually allow us to move things forward. I'm going to tell you about the Colorado story while I was governor, and I do that with great humility. And I mean humility in this respect. Not all states are alike. I know that. The resources are different from state to state to state. And the ability to do many of the things that one state may do that shows real progress can be hampered in other states. In some respects by limited resources. It can be hampered by limited economic resources. But I don't think that we should keep from telling a story just because there's not a cookie-cutter approach. I'm going to tell the Colorado story, and I'm going to finish up after that by talking about sort of the barriers that exist today and how we continue to try and move this clean energy agenda forward in the United States of America, state by state. So the number one thing I think is important, and this is kind of an operating principle for me as a person who was governor. I'd served actually as the district attorney of Denver for 12 years before that. I lived in Africa as a Catholic missionary for a few years. I was back in Colorado about 3 years before I became the district attorney. I was a prosecutor really by my history, so I did not have an energy background. But as I began to campaign over about a 1.5 year period, I realized that energy was an issue that we as a state could take great advantage of if we promoted a clean energy agenda. And so we developed operating principles. How did we want to think and talk about it? And for me, it was this, that we as a country, but let's just talk about Colorado, could do a much better job of diversifying our energy portfolio and relying upon domestic clean energy. And for us, it was solar, it was wind, natural gas was included in the mix. There's a lot of work we had to do in the natural gas world, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But that was number one, right? That we could change the way we thought about energy. Included in our discussion about clean domestic energy was energy efficiency. It's really a way for us to not just diversify the energy portfolio, but to reduce our energy use and find an ability to do a variety of things from that. The second thing was that in looking at this, when we were talking about clean energy or energy efficiency, we're actually talking about answering serious environmental challenges. Not just that we had in Colorado, but a variety of states have across the country. But we could actually change the energy portfolio and respond to environmental challenges. I happen to be a person who believes in the existence of human-caused climate change and actually talked about that and talked about it without embarrassment or shame while I was the governor of Colorado. And even at the beginning of it, well, there's a lot of governors in this country right now that are very afraid of this issue. And while they understand that it exists, actually don't make it a part of their lexicon because it's become part of this political fault line that exists in this country. You're either for or against it, you either accept it or you deny it. The fact of the matter is, there are a variety of environmental issues apart from climate change that you can talk about as well and that you can resolve by focusing on a different energy portfolio that's clean, domestic, or involves energy efficiency. So it was energy and it was the environment. The third was economic development, that we saw the real ability to create jobs by thinking differently about clean energy. And in Colorado, we believed that we had this research and development corridor. I know I'm here in Stanford University, but I used to go around the world as governor and say that Colorado had the best research corridor for renewable energy anywhere in the world. Because we have the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, we have now a couple of private groups working on it. Siemens has a wind test center there. ConocoPhillips is building their renewable and alternative energy global research facility. And then we had Colorado State University, Colorado School of Mines, and CU. I know, again, I say that with some hesitancy here at Stanford because of all the great work, but what I'll tell you, I said it all over the world, and no one ever disagreed with me. And that's an index for a governor, that you're telling the truth. That's a little joke at the end of the day. Anyway, so it was about economic development, and we said, okay, those are three good operating principles. There was a nice mnemonic device, energy, environment, economic development. They all began with E. But I added a fourth, and that fourth was what we called equity. So I think it was really important in this discussion about energy to be able to convince people we could build out a clean energy agenda and a clean energy economy and do it without building it on the backs of poor people. And I understand this issue has actually international implications around the globe. Just talking as a governor and a candidate as governor, talked about it in terms of what it meant to the ratepayers in Colorado, what it meant to middle income, lower income, and to poor people. People who actually live in poverty and pay energy bills every month. Could we really do this, build out this clean energy economy? So I'm going to tell you a story about a couple of different things that we did and just kind of let you see how that worked out for us, and we think it was positive. And we're going to talk about the barriers to doing that in other states and some of the ways we can move it forward. And in Colorado, one of the things that's really important to understand is in 2006 when I was running, I had the benefit of knowing that the people of that state actually approved of renewable energy and a renewable energy standard. We were the first state in the country where we passed a renewable energy standard on the ballot. So we went to the voters in 2004, and there was a great deal of opposition, a great deal of organized opposition, including the main investor-owned utility, Xcel Energy. But the voters of the state approved a 10% renewable energy standard. They approved it by 2015, and 50 cents a month was the charge that could be put on it to pay for it. So it's a pretty low charge. The legislature had actually changed that to 1%. When I became governor, it was clear that Xcel Energy was going to meet the renewable energy standard. We had not included the rural electric associations or small municipal utilities in that, so we moved to including them and to doubling the renewable energy standard for the investor-owned utility. We did it with a 2% rate cap. We felt we could do that. We put it at 2020, and the investor-owned utility, Xcel Energy, supported it. They did so in part because they saw the appetite for renewable energy in Colorado in their customer base. They actually asked people to sign up for wind, to be subscribers. Jeannie and I were part of the subscription in Denver, but they had far more demand for that than they had on the grid. You have to understand, when I became governor, there were 275 megawatts of wind on the grid in Colorado. There was more wind on the grid in Rhode Island. And we have ranches that are much bigger than Rhode Island in Colorado, and they had more wind on the grid than Colorado's, 275 megawatts. So we moved it to a 20% renewable energy standard with a 2% rate cap, believing that the rate cap was a really important part for us to, again, be able to protect ratepayers over time. In 2010, my last year as governor, we decided to move it to 30%, a 30% renewable energy standard for the investor-owned utility, and we were able to do that without changing the rate cap. Because the price of energy on the renewable side was coming down as I governed. The price of solar came down pretty seriously, but the price of wind had come down really pretty significantly. There was some improvement in technology. We were starting to build it out in a more serious way, and there was some competition among the wind farms, the people who were building out the wind farms. And so we got to a place where it was not necessary for us to change the rate cap at all to go to a 30% renewable energy standard. I was recently speaking at the Brookings Institute, and I said, well, I was the last speaker, and someone from California spoke before me, and they said they had the most aggressive renewable energy standard in America. Then a guy from New York stood up and said, no, we have the most aggressive renewable energy standard in America. Well, I'd been saying the whole time I was governor, we had the second most aggressive standard. So when I gave my remarks, I said, we have the second most aggressive standard. We just don't know who we're second to, New York or California, because there's this argument. I think we're second to California, but the fact of the matter is we've been able to build this out in a pretty serious way. And as I said, there were 275 megawatts of wind when I began. There will be 2,000 megawatts of wind at the end of this year. So over a 5-year period, we increased from 275 to 2,000. It's really important, and we're going to talk again about equity a little bit later on, but it's really important to understand that the price of wind has come down pretty seriously. Xcel Energy just purchased 200 megawatts of wind from NextEra. They purchased it with an agreement of 50% capacity. For those of you who know wind, you understand that means NextEra is promising that at least 50% of the time that wind farm will operate at full capacity of 200 megawatts, and the price on that wind was 3.2 cents a kilowatt hour. So I looked at Bert's graph up here about the levelized cost of energy, and I think he still had it at 9 cents, 8.5 or 9 cents, and a lot of people were talking about that in 2007, 2008. That graph was 2010. I was just in Texas yesterday. There's a big deal for wind in Texas where it was a similar kind of pricing, 3.1, 3.2 cents a kilowatt hour, and so we've seen a dramatic decrease in the price of wind, and the levelized cost of wind over a 10, 20-year period is such that it's much cheaper than almost any other source with the production tax credit, but you can take the production tax credit away, and it's still cheaper than coal in Colorado, where we actually extract coal, and it's actually about the same, maybe a little bit more expensive than natural gas, if natural gas remains at about $4.5 an MCF. So it's a fairly cheap source of power, and we're able to do that, again, with this 30% renewable energy standard. The second thing we really tried to focus on was this issue about energy efficiency, and it was in a variety of ways. Some of it was sort of government leading by example. Certainly there was the ARA funding that came in and helped us increase almost triple the number of homes that we were able to weatherize of poor people to really bring their energy costs down because they were using less energy. And then we did just a variety of things in trying to promote industrial energy efficiency. We didn't decouple. We have a regulated market in Colorado, but we did go to the utility and talk to them about how we would engage in demand-side management. We actually passed a bill that allows them to recover costs for different things they do with respect to demand-side management. So there was a big effort on energy efficiency with respect to sort of a variety of different bills. So it was renewable energy, energy efficiency, trying to change the energy portfolio. The other thing we did was look at natural gas, and in my last year as governor, we engaged in a fuel switch, which meant that we wrote a bill that said to the PUC, we want you to switch out up to 950 megawatts of coal if you can put in place these things. There were a variety of things that they had to do, including look at the ability for long-term contracting between the utility and the natural gas industry with protections built in, again, for ratepayers. But it was what you call a fuel switch, coal to natural gas. That wasn't the beginning of the story, though. That bill in year 4 was not the beginning of the story. The beginning of that story is that when I became governor, we were dealing with 30-year-old rules on developing natural gas. And I know, again, there was a great presentation, Mark Zorberg this morning was fantastic, but we walked through a pretty big fight in 2007 with the industry because we had gone from about 1,000 wells a year permitted in 1999 to over 7,000 permitted in 2007. And so dealing with 30-year-old rules that didn't actually deal with directional drilling or hydraulic fracturing, had no wildlife management as part of the planning in the permitting process. We felt there was a variety of things we needed to do, and so we started by just redoing the entire commission. Our commission by statute was controlled by industry. So we had to go in and say, we're no longer going to have a statute or a regulatory commission that must be controlled by industry. We're going to redo that. We put 9 people on the commission, only 3 from industry, but then a variety of other disciplines. And then we went through a year of rulemaking around natural gas that was really quite painful because of the way it was sort of written about. The media loved the confrontation. They loved that the swords crossed day in and day out in the rulemaking process. We actually got to a place where the industry and the environmental community and my office agreed that we were at a good place where we had environmentally sound rules, but that the industry could survive. Now what happened? Gas went from $13 an MCF down to $2 an MCF. Drilling largely shut down, and people looked at our rules, said, we told you this rulemaking was going to shut down the industry in Colorado. It didn't. The industry came back. We are, I think, among states in the Intermountain West, we have the second most drilling rigs in Intermountain West. New Mexico has more than we do, but the industry would say to other states, do it like they did in Colorado. There are a set of rules that we can live with. We're actually moving to this place of complete transparency. We didn't do that in 2008 because the industry made an argument it was a bridge too far, and we'd done so much else. But our process is pretty nimble, and I think we'll get to the place where this November we'll have full transparency in fracking fluids, and that'll, I think, again help Colorado be looked to by other states as a place where you can look at rules that do this in an environmentally sound way. Because we were able to say we were doing a better job with environmentally sound extraction, then I felt comfortable moving to a fuel switching bill, coal to natural gas bill, and we passed that. It went through the Public Utilities Commission. It's involved in litigation presently, but we believe it's going to survive the litigation. And so you just kind of look at this and say, okay, let's go back and test those operating principles you had against the things that you did, the renewable energy standard, the energy efficiency, the coal to gas switch. You should know I signed 57 different bills that had to do somehow with clean energy. So it wasn't just about these 3 things. It was really about a variety of things, many of the things that we borrowed from California. We didn't have the ability to have solar leasing. We didn't have the ability to have community-owned solar gardens, things of that nature. And so, including the PACE program, we put in place the PACE program first locally, then regionally, and then statewide. For those of you who don't know, that's property values where you agree to increase your property tax assessment, and using that increase, the local government will bond against the future income, and they'll pay for renewable systems or energy efficiency systems on the home. And you've basically amortized the cost of that over a 20 or 25-year period. Somebody came to me and they said, I really want to talk to you about PACE. And I think, Governor, you're going to like this. They're doing it successfully in Berkeley and Boulder. And I said, if you're the governor of Colorado and you want to get tomatoes thrown at you, you tell people that this has worked in Berkeley and Boulder. Because they're kind of viewed as different kinds of places in many places in Colorado. And so we went ahead and we just didn't mention Berkeley and Boulder. We just passed it. And it went on the ballot in 3 different counties the following November, and in all 3 counties, in Eagle and Pitkin and Gunnison County, it passed. Now, there's been a problem with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac in the PACE program. If it comes back, we were seeing this really significant appetite among middle-income and lower-middle-income Americans, Coloradans, who wanted to put renewable systems or energy efficiency systems and were willing to use that increased property tax assessment for their way of financing that over a 20 to 30-year period. Leasing was another one of those ways. So for our purposes, we did a variety of really important things, and then we said, okay, let's measure it back against what we said. Energy portfolio. I already told you that wind went from 275 to 2,000 megawatts. We're going to get to that 30% renewable energy standard for the investor-owned utilities and 10% for the rural electric associations. And that's going to come, and we think we're going to arrive there even before 2020, before the 2020 deadline. So there's a great deal that you can see in terms of reducing emissions with a significant transition to solar and to wind. Now, we are a state that has significant solar and significant wind, so the resources helped us. The second part about that was just the environmental, those things that have to do with environmental challenges. And let's just take the CO2 emissions. If you reduce your coal from 65 to 70% of your resource to about 35 to 40% of your resource in a small amount of time, in a 7-year period, like from 2010 to 2017. That's when the fuel switching has to happen, and we'll get this renewable portfolio will expand significantly by 2017, be to 30% by 2020. Then the emissions portfolio changes pretty dramatically over that small amount of time. And what's really important about this is that it's not just about CO2. You also, in the fuel switch from coal to natural gas, eliminate 70 to 80% of your nitrogen oxide and your sulfur dioxide. A state like Colorado actually has a really significant mercury issue. We have lakes in Colorado where we must post warnings to pregnant women and to children not to eat fish out of the lakes, or to be warned that they may be in peril eating fish out of those lakes because of the mercury content in the fish. I brought the guy who caught the record lake trout in Colorado, brought him into my office, 53-pound lake trout out of Blue Mesa Reservoir, and the media said, well, did you take it home and eat it? And he said, oh God, no, there's way too much mercury in that. And I mean, he's right. He's exactly right. You can't eat that fish. It's 53 pounds, but a lot of that has to do with mercury content. Not a lot of it, not a lot of the weight, but there's enough mercury content, obviously, that it just can't be, right? You just can't digest something that has that much and not be afraid. And so we posted warnings. Well, that's going to go away in terms of that gigawatt of power that we're shutting down with that transition, but also anything that we're able to substitute in really pushing coal. The economic development side of this is really important. And I was having a conversation with Tom early at lunch that we kind of got interrupted because Tom was part of the panel, but we were not a state that put cash on the barrelhead to try and get companies to come to Colorado. We just had never played that way. We actually had lost some different competitions, over the years in watching us, vie for a Boeing plant. There were a variety of things, a United Maintenance Center. So we never had much in the kitty to put on the table. And we decided, with respect to clean energy, that we're just going to try and do it through policy and just make the case that we as a state, we're going to do all we can to provide market certainty to companies that were considering us. So we're in a competition right at the very beginning of my time as governor with Texas and Ohio to bring a Vestas manufacturing plant, biggest wind turbine manufacturer in the world. We're going to try and bring them to Colorado, and we're fighting with Texas and Ohio, and both of them had significant cash on the barrelhead. And then we signed our 20% renewable energy standard and laid out the case for other things we were going to do policy-wise on clean energy. Vestas made a commitment to Colorado with that first plant of 400 workers and has since decided to put all of its manufacturing in Colorado and then bring their supply chain in as well. That's about 2,500 jobs with just the Vestas jobs and then supply jobs as well. So we're manufacturing wind turbines in Colorado. This is not just a Colorado story. You could tell this story in Michigan, in Ohio, in Illinois, in Indiana, and places around the Midwest that have a significant manufacturing presence, where they also found that transitioning to a clean energy economy was allowing them to grow their workforce, even during the downturn. So, it wasn't just Vestas for Colorado either. SMA Solar had never manufactured solar inverters outside of Germany. They chose Colorado. is a place to bring a manufacturing plant with 700 workers. ConocoPhillips. We didn't even know it was ConocoPhillips we were dealing with, so it wasn't about putting cash on the barrelhead. We were just talking to a company that wanted to come and occupy a 732-acre campus that had been owned by Sun Microsystems but never really inhabited by Sun Microsystems. They purchased the campus. It turned out to be ConocoPhillips, and they're purchasing it for the purposes of building this global facility for renewable and alternative research. And, you know, they haven't said how many jobs it's going to be, but the reason they're there is because there's this ecosystem around clean energy that's not just about public policy. It is about research and development. It is about public policy, but they see that this is a state that's trying to move this agenda, and ConocoPhillips made their decision based on that. And we did a variety of things for small companies, for mid-sized companies. We were helped, in fact, by loan guarantee money in the Recovery Act. We have a company called Abound Solar that's really the story of the new energy economy. It was developed, a technology on thin film photovoltaic that was developed at CSU, helped along by the Department of Energy and the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and it got to a place where it got VC money from a variety of places, including California, but got kind of to that place where it needed to double in size, and the demand was there. Just looking for the funding. It was during the downturn. They had loan guarantee money, and so now they're manufacturing in Colorado and manufacturing in Indiana, and there's a real market for their price. And what they would say at Abound is they look at solar and they believe that they can get to grid parity. With their technology, they can compete with coal and natural gas by 2020. Some of them actually say 2015, but I think the more rational ones say 2020. That's the kind of investment we should be making in a technology. It's a new technology, but where we've seen the price curve come down and down and down. And so we saw a great deal of economic development even during the downturn. And if you looked at all the industries in the private sector during the worst recession since the Great Depression, only one grew, and it's clean tech. It was the only place in Colorado where we actually saw job creation and saw job growth that was in the black. And so for us, this issue about economic development, we believe, was proved out by a variety of things we were able to do, but certainly pushing this clean energy agenda. And so there's this issue about equity. Did we really protect ratepayers in doing it? It's really pretty fascinating that at the beginning of the time that I was governor, we began pushing this clean energy agenda, we were about 19% below the average cost of energy around the country. So energy is like most other things, even in the downturn where people have experienced some energy inflation. But over that 4-year period, our price of energy in Colorado got cheaper relative to the rest of the country. The average cost of energy was Colorado was 22% below the rest of the country. We'd been 19 at the beginning. And you have to understand, in telling this story, we had naysayer after naysayer who came after us really hard. Said you could never get to a 30% renewable energy standard without being far too expensive, or the resource wouldn't be there. Well, the resource was intermittent, and it was impossible for us to really deliver reliable, affordable, domestic power to the people of Colorado. And what we're doing is proving them wrong. It is possible to do that. And then, you know, there's still a variety of people today who talk about sort of, they call the myth of green jobs. I don't use the word green. We use the word clean. Green in the Intermountain West can be kind of a pejorative term. So we talk about clean energy and clean energy jobs. And so they're still, you know, out there saying it doesn't work this way. And yet we have people who are going to work every day in jobs that did not exist in 2007. And a lot of people going to work every day in jobs that didn't exist in 2007 that are good paying jobs, that are clean energy jobs, that have to do with the production of wind turbines or the manufacturing of solar, the installation of solar, the installation of a variety of things that have to do with energy efficiency, and quite frankly, in the natural gas industry as well, where we've seen a great deal of job creation. So it was there. The economic development part of it was there. The environmental, the emissions issues, the environmental issues were issues that we tackled and we believed so successfully. And it was with a great deal of opposition. So what I'll tell you as I close is just that now what I'm doing is trying to work with states across the country to develop places where we can help states, governors, legislators, with developing a clean energy agenda. Many places, you know, it's already done, or they're farther ahead than needing our help. California is one such place. So there's a lot of states where we believe we can move this agenda. Because I was a governor, because I was one of the 50 governors, I'm mindful to not go in and say, listen, we did it all in Colorado. If you just do what we did, replicate this, then you're going to be just fine. You can, take care of your 4 E's. And yet we think that there's some lessons to be learned, not just from Colorado, but if you look cumulatively at what the states have been able to do, there are really important lessons to be learned. Let me just talk about some of the barriers. One certainly is that one size doesn't fit all. So you really have to go in and find out sort of what's the way of tailoring the work you're doing to the resources available, to the workforce that's available, and to some extent to the sort of political will with the decision makers in the state. That may be one of the most difficult things. And partly it's difficult because when you're talking about energy, you're talking about, in many places in this country, regulated markets. A lot of places where it's non-regulated, but even in the non-regulated markets, we were most successful by doing things and telling the industry, the utility industry, actually, that they need to do them. Tom and I were talking about the place that a mandate, like a renewable energy standard. A lot of people look at a renewable energy standard and they say, well, that's a mandate. Why tell an industry to do that? In Colorado and in many places, like I said, the utility is a regulated industry. And if you don't, put in place some way for them to think about what they must do, they're going to pretty much do what I think Bert called business as usual. They're not going to change what they're doing in the status quo unless there's some requirement to do it. So for us, the most effective ways of really moving this clean energy economy was through things like a renewable energy standard, an energy efficiency resource standard, net metering, quite frankly, was very helpful in all that, but also the whole issue around regulation, greenhouse gas emission regulation, and needing to meet certain goals made a difference for us. When we passed our fuel switching bill from coal to natural gas, we did that with a bipartisan coalition of legislators, including the minority leader in the Senate, a prominent Republican, and the minority leader in the House, a prominent Republican. He's now the Speaker of the House. And they were in favor of that, and partly they were in favor of it because they said, we don't want the EPA telling us how we should produce energy. We have a way of getting to what the EPA requires of us, wants us to do in our state implementation plan. We'll get there, but we'll get there our way. We don't want to get there with the EPA telling us we have to do it a different way. And actually that was quite helpful. So in that case, regulation was helpful for us. For people in this country who disapprove of government mandates or disapprove of regulation of greenhouse gas emissions, this becomes a much more difficult thing to do as we work from state to state to state. And if somebody says, we just don't want to tell a utility to do it. I've had people from the utility world say, we actually want to be told. We want to be told that this is the thing that you want us to do. In part because they're investor-owned, and so they've got to respond back to their shareholders, and also in part because they get criticized pretty heavily for doing things that impact rates. And some of that stuff, the ways they get criticized oftentimes is by people speculating about what this will be, about what it's really going to cost at the end of the day. Many of the speculators from 2004 or 2007 about renewable energy standards were wrong in their speculation about what the cost of this, the price of it would be. But the fact of the matter is the utility still has to deal with that. And like I said, they've said to me, listen, we want to be told about that. So those are some of the barriers. The other barrier certainly is that we have been in this downturn. And so much about developing a clean energy economy is about private capital being invested and moving it forward. We think, we believe, we hope that changes over time, but that certainly has been a barrier. The fact still remains that it may be a while before we have a coherent, cohesive national energy policy, and that our best bet for the time being may be to look at states and ask, how can we do what's necessary to build out this new energy economy and do it in a way that respects the 4 E's. Thank you for the opportunity to be here, and I'll take some questions.
What's your opinion about multi-tiered retail pricing for electricity?
So as long as you set the price right, the criticism of some of the utilities is that they were allowed to do multi-tiered pricing by the Regulatory Commission, the Utilities Commission of the what's called Public Service Commission, and they picked a a point of usage that was too low. So people who shouldn't be paying that second tier pricing are actually paying it. You look at the average, usage and ask what should a middle income home be using during summer hours. It's going to depend on where they live and what their usage is, but there are, I agree that it should happen, but I think that the utilities and the commission should be careful about trying not to price, again, lower middle income, poor people out of energy usage because they've put the usage tier too low. In Colorado, XL chose 500 kilowatt hours and 500 kilowatt hours a month, and then you went into the second tier. 500 kilowatt hours is a pretty low ceiling. There are a lot of people who said it should have been 600 because the average usage is actually over 500. Yes.
Thanks. You pointed out that Colorado has very substantial wind and solar resources. And I wonder, as you travel around the country, what do you encounter in states that don't have renewable resources that are as strong as Colorado's, particularly states that have population densities much greater than Colorado's? What's the political appetite for the sort of regulations that you promulgated in Colorado?
I was just in Kentucky and dealing with a group of folks who, are in the heart of coal country, and there are a lot of people saying, well, we're Kentucky, we don't have renewable resources. They pointed out that their resources in Kentucky for solar are much greater than Germany, and yet the deployment of solar in Germany is really significant. I say that also knowing that there are states that could not meet a renewable energy standard the likes of 30%. In fact, I think there are states right now that have renewable energy standards that are going to have a difficult time meeting them. And that's, I think the president was really wise in his State of the Union to talk about a low carbon standard and talk about it generally nationally. I think, I testified before the Senate, and it was the Senate Committee on Public Works and Environment, and we were talking about job creation in clean energy, and it was a particularly distasteful experience because I got pretty beat up from a group of senators there. One of them said, why are you even here? You have all this oil shale, you have all this natural gas. The governor of Washington leaned into my ear and whispered, why are we here? Because nobody seemed to be listening that much, but what was really interesting was talking to a couple of Republican senators afterwards who I think really, what I would call centrist, and they said, listen, if if the states, instead of talking about renewable energy standards, would include nuclear and natural gas in an energy policy that was a low carbon policy, we think there's a group of us who could be there. And I think that's the right approach. I think that's the right national approach. We've got to get this, the extraction of natural gas right. One of the things that I wanted to ask Bert, and maybe Bert you'll have an opportunity to respond. One of the problems I have with nuclear from the perspective of a governor is understanding the time it takes to go from planning and permitting to actually implementing and the testing that it takes. And one of the things we're trying to do is look at this emissions issue and actually get to some really serious reductions by 2020 and get to even more serious reductions by 2050. And I think we have to think when we talk about nuclear, about all the other things that Bert and other people in the audience sort of talked about with respect to issues around building out nuclear. But one of those issues is, can it be done in a fashion that's timely? Can it be done in a fashion that's affordable and really help us reduce our emissions in a serious way?
Tom Overby from University of Illinois. I've got two questions that are related. What happens to the utilities if they don't meet the renewable portfolio standard? And then also you mentioned in Colorado there's one standard for the investor utilities and then a lower standard for the rural co-ops. Why are those different?
So first of all, what happens to them, in a regulated market, the utility is going to get spanked by the Public Utility Commission. They have a variety of ways of punishing them. It's not going to happen in Colorado because they're going to meet the standard, but nobody goes to jail, if that's what you mean. There's no financial penalty, but there may be some issues around cost recovery penalties that they might otherwise get that they don't get. They do that. Now, what's interesting is this question about rural electric associations, because they're not regulated, and neither are municipal utilities, and they have this 10% standard. And so there's not a built-in enforcement mechanism. And it's not just that this is a suggestion, it really is a standard. Everybody's, aiming at meeting the standard, but legislatively, what could happen is the legislature theoretically could come back and do something to punish them. It's really the investor-owned utilities who have, I think, the greatest peril that they would be in, and it's not a lot of peril by not meeting the standard. Was there a second question? Is that it? Okay.
Eric Lemons, if the U.S. Congress could get the will to implement an engineering policy, what would you like to see them do if you were governor, and what would you like them not to do?
Well, I think the most important thing that the Congress could do right now that I believe is over time will become politically doable, may not be doable today for a variety of reasons having to do with national politics in the November 2012 election, it's to put a price on carbon. We're just not pricing this externality. We need to internalize the price of carbon, and in doing that, I think you'd see what I would call a greater deal of market certainty. One of the reasons there's so much capital sitting on the sidelines is they just don't know, right? And even doing it, like we did it in Colorado or other states have done it, doing it from state to state, doesn't give you a national, industry-wide market certainty. And I think we would inspire a great deal of investment on both the manufacturing side, but on the deployment side as well. You'd see job creation happen as a result of it. And there's a variety of ideas that are sort of out there about what you might do if, in fact, you put a price on carbon. Some of those ideas we hope would be attractive to both sides of the aisle. There are people who are talking about just taking it and devoting it to debt reduction, something that everybody in this country is spending a lot of time thinking about, care a great deal about. Just price carbon and reduce the debt. There are other people saying, well, price it, reduce the debt, but also create some kind of a green or a clean energy infrastructure bank. Those things are all, I think they would make a tremendous difference. And quite frankly, I think the whole discussion about cap and trade is dead for a very long time. The Waxman-Markey bill became sort of demonized, and there are a lot of people who think cap and trade, sort of this four-letter word. And so just pricing carbon alone is something that would make, I believe, a great deal of difference and may not get you to the place of coherent, cohesive energy policy. The other thing that I think is we can't back off on research and development. And I know Dan Arvizu was here yesterday. It was coincidental that he was here talking about his laboratory and really the important work that they're doing. He announced 150 layoffs yesterday because of the budget from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. So for us, at this time in our sort of history as a country, to be backing off on R&D around renewable energy is really a mistake.
Well, perhaps I'll take moderator's prerogative and ask the last question. So your experience in Colorado reminds me that in a way we do have a national energy policy, but it's determined by at least 50 public utilities commissions, but perhaps with other state government apparatus. Is there a conversation amongst the public utilities commissions that has the potential to help us go forward in changing the energy systems?
Well, I went to the National Association of Regulators and Utility Commission, their meeting, and it's called NARUC as the association. Many of you probably know that. There was actually, there was a conversation, but it was more of a debate. And, again, thinking about sort of this issue around clean energy and even climate change having become somewhat, I would call, politicized, you could see this at NARUC. There were debates in committees about whether they should, move forward resolutions that would have promoted clean energy or promote sort of dealing with issues around emissions. I think there was even a debate about these utility commissioners weighing in on whether the the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, should have greenhouse gas emissions authority. This is unseen before, right? That this is happening, and so utility commissioners are appointed by governors, and it really is sad, I think, that there is an appetite among many of those commissioners, and we're dealing with some of them with the center that I'm at CSU, to actually try and work on a clean energy agenda, But we've found in many different circles that this issue has become sort of a debatable political issue. And what I think we need to do is work every day to try and remove the politics from this, to try and make it not about the politics, make it about the science, make it about the economy. And we think probably, this argument about job creation, we just need to build the evidence around the ability to create an economy out of the clean tech and clean energy sector. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You bet. Thank you.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.